There is a skeleton in a Danish field that does not match the story carved onto its grave marker. For 2 centuries, we thought we understood the Vikings of Denmark. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, a single fierce bloodline pouring out of the Scandinavian north to raid, trade, and conquer. It was a clean story, a satisfying story, the kind of story that fits neatly into a textbook chapter and a museum diorama. Et Faunius. Then scientists opened the bones. What they found inside the genome did not confirm the legend. It complicated it. It split it open into something stranger, older, and far more human than the helmeted, that blood-pure warrior of popular imagination. The Vikings, it turns out, were never one people pretending to be many. They were many peoples who became, for a few centuries, one idea. Alert. This is the story of how ancient DNA quietly dismantled one of Europe's most cherished myths and what was found underneath. For most of modern memory, the Viking story has been told the same way. Beginning in the late 8th century, seafarers from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden launched outward across the North Atlantic and beyond. They raided English monasteries, settled in Ireland, sailed the rivers of Russia, and eventually reached the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. Denmark, in particular, became associated with a specific genetic and cultural identity tall. They're Nordic in the strictest sense, a homogeneous population shaped by isolation and harsh winters. This version of history was built by genuine scholarship. Archaeologists traced ship burials and rune stones. Linguists followed the spread of Old Norse. Historians read the sagas, the chronicles written by the very monks the Vikings terrorized. Out of these sources came a portrait that felt complete. A single Scandinavian people, ethnically uniform, whose descendants could be traced in an unbroken line straight back to the Viking Age. It made sense, it photographed well, and for a long time, Elseville's, almost no one had the tools to test it, but there were always small inconsistencies, the kind historians tend to quietly set aside because they don't fit the frame. Viking burial sites in Denmark sometimes contained grave goods that had no local origin combs carved in a style associated with the British Isles. Beads that researchers traced to trade networks stretching toward the Black Sea and beyond. Some skeletons identified through artifacts and burial ritual as Viking warriors showed skeletal markers more consistent with populations from outside Scandinavia entirely. A scattering of graves, here and there, simply did not fit the expected pattern. For decades, archaeologists explained this away as trade, as cultural exchange, as the ordinary residue of a seafaring people who moved across vast distances. Bearable, reasonable enough, except the anomalies kept appearing, not in one site, but in many. Not in one century, but across the entire Viking Age. Something was leaving traces in the archaeological record that the old narrative could not fully account for. It was a quiet problem, the kind that doesn't make headlines until someone finds a way to read it directly from the bone. That moment arrived with ancient DNA. Unlike artifacts, which can travel through trade and imitation, DNA does not lie about ancestry. It is a biological record, sealed inside the cells of a person who lived and died centuries ago, waiting for the right technology to read it. Researchers working with remains from Viking Age burial sites across Denmark and the wider Scandinavian world began extracting genetic material preserved in petrous bones, the dense portion of the skull that protects inner ear structures. It prized by geneticists because it preserves DNA exceptionally well. From these fragments, scientists could examine several different layers of ancestry at once. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down only through the maternal line, offered a window into deep population history on the mother's side. Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son, revealed paternal lineages, and whole genome sequencing, reading the full genetic blueprint, not just a single lineage, allowed researchers to compare ancient Scandinavians not just to each other, but to ancient and modern populations across Europe, census, the British Isles, and beyond. The genome, in other words, became a far older archive than any saga or chronicle. It did not care what the Vikings called themselves. It only recorded who their ancestors actually were. Bagger, if you enjoy this kind of science-driven history stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most of us were ever taught. X. What the DNA revealed did not simply confirm the old image of a single unified Scandinavian people. It revealed something layered, something far less tidy, across hundreds of ancient genomes recovered from Viking Age sites. Researchers found that the population of Viking Age Scandinavia was not genetically homogeneous at all. Even within Denmark, ancestry varied significantly from one region to another, and from one individual to the next. Some communities carried strong genetic continuity with earlier Scandinavian populations stretching back to the Bronze Age. Others showed clear signals of ancestry from outside Scandinavia, entirely from the British Isles, from the Baltic region, and in some individual cases, from populations further south and east. Carried along the same trade and raiding routes the sagas described. That was not a contradiction, it was a signal. The story did not collapse, it widened. What looked, on the surface, felt like a single ethnic group expanding outward in longships was beginning to look like something closer to a network, a shifting, intermixing population connected more by culture, language, and shared identity than by a single bloodline. People who called themselves Norse, who fought under Norse customs and were buried with Norse rites, did not always share a uniform ancestral background. That some individuals buried with full Viking warrior honors, weapons and all, carried genetic ancestry that traced back not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles or further afield descendants, perhaps, of earlier contact, intermarriage, or captives absorbed into Scandinavian communities and fully integrated into their world. There are a few ways researchers have tried to make sense of this layered picture, India, and it is worth sitting with each of them because no single explanation accounts for everything the genome has shown. Century. One possibility is large-scale admixture, centuries of intermarriage and population mixing between Scandinavians and the peoples they encountered through trade, raiding, and settlement, particularly around the British Isles, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon and Gaelic populations lived in close, often violent, often intimate contact for generations. A second possibility points further back in time, based to earlier migrations into Scandinavia itself, populations arriving in the region long before the Viking Age from the Baltic coast, from continental Europe, layering themselves into the genetic landscape over thousands of years. So that Scandinavian ancestry was never a single stream to begin with, but a confluence of older ones. A third possibility is cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the idea that Viking identity itself was, in part, an adoptable identity, that a person did not need pure Scandinavian ancestry to become Norse in language, religion, and way of life, and that the archaeological Vikings we identify by grave goods and burial ritual may represent a far more genetically diverse group than the word itself implies. Each of these explanations carries real evidence behind it, else none of them on its own accounts for the full picture, and that, researchers suggest, may be the point. The Viking world was not assembled by one process. It was assembled by all of them, layered across centuries, leaving a genome that reads less like a single chapter and more like a palimpsest, one story written over another and another beneath that. The most significant turning point came from large-scale ancient genome studies that compared hundreds of Viking Age individuals across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and parts of continental Europe. Research built not on a handful of skeletons, but on a broad comparative dataset large enough to detect patterns invisible at smaller scale. This was different from earlier, narrower studies. It did not simply ask whether a few outlier burials looked unusual. It mapped ancestry across an entire population, region by region, generation by generation. And the picture that emerged complicated the founding myth at its core. Genetic ancestry within Scandinavia during the Viking Age was not uniform even between neighboring regions of Denmark. Sverige, Norway, and Sweden each showed distinguishable, though overlapping, ancestry profiles, evidence of populations that had been historically distinct before the Viking Age united them under a shared cultural and economic system. That year, Denmark in particular showed genetic influence from continental Europe not fully present in parts of Norway and Sweden, suggesting that Viking Denmark sat at a genetic crossroads long before its ships ever left the harbor. Here is the twist researchers were not entirely expecting. It was not simply that outsiders joined the Vikings, it was that in many cases, whilst the genetic exchange ran in directions the old narrative never anticipated ancestry moving into Scandinavia from the regions Vikings raided, not only outward from Scandinavia into the lands they conquered. As some individuals buried in Britain with full Scandinavian Viking rights carried local British ancestry, not Norse ancestry at all. Second or third generation descendants of mixed communities who had fully adopted Norse identity despite having little or no Scandinavian blood, not the population researchers expected. Not even the direction of contact they expected. The genome was not simply confirming a one-way invasion. It was revealing a far messier, far more reciprocal process identity moving faster and further than ancestry. Culture absorbing strangers and remaking them as kin, while genetic material moved quietly back and forth across the North Sea in both directions for generations before anyone wrote a saga about it. This matters far beyond the specific case of Denmark, because what the Viking genome reveals is something true of nearly every population, once imagined as ethnically pure, racially uniform, or genetically self-contained. Human history is not a tree with clean, separate branches. It is closer to a river system, streams merging, splitting, rejoining, carrying sediment from 100 different sources. Impossible to fully separate once they've mixed. The idea of a pure Viking bloodline, like the idea of a pure anything, turns out to be a modern invention layered backward onto a past that never worked that way. People moved, people intermarried, people adopted new gods, new languages, new identities, while their bodies carried the quiet evidence of where they or their grandparents had actually come from. Migration was never a single clean event. It was constant, low-level, ongoing a process, not an episode. Picture for a moment a Danish coastline in late autumn, centuries before any of this was understood. Gray water meeting gray sky. Long ships pulled onto pale sand, smoke rising from turf-roofed halls further inland. Inside one of those halls might sit a warrior with British ancestry on his mother's side, speaking flawless Old Norse, worshipping Norse gods, utterly Viking in every way that mattered to the people around him, and utterly unaware that 900 years later, at a fragment of bone behind his ear would tell a story his own community had already forgotten, or never knew, or simply never thought worth mentioning. That is the strange intimacy of ancient DNA. It does not care about the stories we tell ourselves. It only remembers what actually happened to the body. And if stories like this fascinate you, moments where the evidence quietly rewrites what we thought we understood about a people, let me know in the comments which population deserves this treatment next. Right? The Danish Vikings, then, were never quite what the old story made them out to be. Not a single pure bloodline sweeping outward from the fjords. Something more layered, something assembled, held, generation after generation, out of contact and conflict and intermarriage long before the word Viking meant anything at all. This does not make their story smaller, it makes it larger and more honest. The old narrative offered a simple people with a simple origin. The genome offers something closer to the truth of how human communities actually form. Messy, mixed, built from outsiders who became insiders, from captives who became kin, from strangers whose grandchildren would one day raise their own swords under a banner their ancestors had never seen. The map is still incomplete. New genomes are still being recovered from new sites, and each one has the potential to complicate the picture further rather than resolve it. That is not a failure of the science. It is the nature of the past itself, a record written in layers, most of them still waiting to be read. What the bones of Denmark seem to be telling us, quietly and without ceremony, is that the Viking world was never built on blood alone. It was built on belonging, and belonging, it turns out, has always been more complicated and more deeply human than any story we have told about it.